Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues. With this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on Series 2 of Sherlock, sent to me by my good friend from across the pond, Howard. Thank you, sir, for doing so. And once again, much like the first series of this particular show, this was really a long time coming, and I just loved and ate up every minute of it. The 3 episodes that comprise this series, much like the first 3, are rife with references to classic Sherlock Holmes stories, as well as other Sherlock Holmes things, from other films to other, book and novel adaptations, spin-offs, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not going to be going too in-depth talking about the episodes or all of the references, but just the things that stuck out to me, much as I did with my Series 1 video talking about that particular series. And so, I mean, from right out of the gate, we have Scandal in Belgravia, which is based on the original story by Arthur Conan Doyle, Scandal in Bohemia. And there are some parallels to that, most definitely. As you get into these episodes in this particular series, you begin to see that they're moving further away from some of the in-story concepts from the original, Conan Doyle canon. And they're sort of telling their own story, weaving their own story, which I was kind of hoping they would do. Keep a lot of those references in there for Sherlockians like myself, but also, weave a sort of new story around all of that. And carrying on with the characterization, which I had to give accolades for in my first series, review video, the dynamics continue to be solid between Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, respectively, as well as their surrounding characters, Mrs. Hudson, the girl Molly. I mean, all of these actors are pitch perfect in their casting. Lestrade, some of the surrounding investigators and such that both Holmes and Watson interact with, some of which do not trust him and everything. All of these things, it's like a grand master plan being strung together, essentially, and I'm just loving it. As I say, the Scandal in Belgravia episode largely has to do with one of my favorite stories, because it has to do with the woman. The one woman who got the best of Sherlock Holmes, and he was forever changed for it. Now, in the original canon, you could arguably say he was kind of put off to women, either because he felt them untrustworthy, or there have been other spins on it in other media and films and such exploring that idea, that this was his one true love. It was kind of like he was so impressed by this woman to get the better of him. There was some sort of romance in between them. And I like these concepts because all of them are sort of ever present in this story. Of course, you have, Irene Adler, who is the woman. I think it's quite interesting that she's sort of a dominatrix in this interpretation. And, but I love little footnotes like she is carrying with her information or photographs, which calls back on that original story. And I think it was one photograph, actually. And in the investigating of it, Holmes, in the original story, actually dupes her into revealing where she's keeping it by faking a fire. And that's exactly what happens in this particular episode. You have Watson knowing ahead of time to do this. And, the whole introduction of Irene Adler was kind of surprising to me in a both a sort of, whoa, I didn't see that coming, and a humana. Laura Pulver, absolutely pitch perfect casting once again, but to see her come in and that first sort of face-off with Holmes, she's saying she's going to wear her armor, and that's very much matching what he tells Watson. He's going to wear his suit of armor, and she comes in stark naked. It's just like, okay, yeah, you want to make Holmes weak in the knees. I don't know if he'd actually succumb as easily as Watson or me in that, particular scenario. But in any case, I like that there is so much that isn't being communicated verbally, and yet there is so much that is being communicated through sight and through visual cues and through hints and those kinds of things. When she does react to this fire alarm being set off, she immediately looks at a mirror in the room. And in the original story, I believe Holmes and Watson were watching from outside through a window to see Irene Adler, reveal the location of whatever she was holding. And in this particular instance, Holmes is very much in the room, and there's the added flavor of like the CIA, but there's this whole idea of his being so taken by Adler and the idea of her besting him, and you're sort of strung through this story with that as the seeming how this is all going to play out, but they turn the tables a couple of times, because at one point Adler comes crawling back, and we see she has affiliations with Moriarty. He's another character I didn't expect to be so ever-present, much like Mycroft, all through these stories. And we see that it's building to a crescendo, of course, through the course of these 3 episodes in Series 2. But they even go so far as, like, I thought it was a little corny, I have to say, that in the trying to break into the cell phone that contains the photographs that, everyone's after Irene Adler for, there's that 4-digit code or whatever it is, and it ends up being, I am Sherlock. I thought that was kind of corny. But it did speak to the idea that the feelings were mutual between Adler and Holmes. And this is something you kind of get the barest hint of in the original story, Scandal in Bohemia. But they really kind of leave it there. They never really explore that. And through the course of the many different adaptations of Sherlock Holmes lore there have been over the years, there have been many interpretations of it. Some have made it an all out-and-out romance. Some have made it just, they're sort of partners in crime, and then they go their separate ways, never to see each other again. And this one, it really keeps flip-flopping from the point where Adler gets the best of Holmes, and Holmes gets a leg up on her, and then in the end they kind of culminate, without wanting to spoil how it all plays out. It seems Adler's life on the line, and her saving grace, in a manner of speaking, is Holmes. So they are very much left at the same sort of level by the end of it. And it's just absolutely fascinating to me. And of course, with, again, Laura Pulver playing that role, she very much embodied that character. She was a woman who was very strong, very fierce, very manipulative, and confident. And, she could exploit her own sexuality by being removed, or I should say as well as being removed, from any concept of, like, weakening herself or defiling herself. She did this and operated within these parameters with as much confidence as Holmes walks around with when he's, deducing things about people, calling out ketchup stains and telling them where they ate their lunch, and all these kinds of things, these mental mind game, mind trips. And the idea that it all surrounded a terrorist bombing that was in the planning stages in any case, and, Mycroft and the government were going to put a bunch of dead people on a plane and blow it up and make them think they had succeeded for just a more benevolent outcome in the governments of the world, and for the terrorists, to pin them down and all this kind of stuff. The complexities of all of these things, it almost feels like when I'm watching these episodes, because they're practically movie length, it almost feels like I'm watching condensed stories, like multiple stories going on, but I never lose sight of what the whole overarching plot is. And again, that rapport between Holmes and Adler, the rapport between Holmes and Watson, and again, their sort of landlady, if you will, Mrs. Hudson, and all these characters, it just absolutely fascinates and thrills me, as a Sherlockian. Then we get into the Hounds of Baskerville, and this story is so intriguing because it's the first step where I feel like we're actually bridging away, as I say, from the original canon, but we're doing it in creative ways. In this case, like, there's an army base and there's genetic manipulation going on, sort of all these different biochemical weapons studies and all that kind of stuff. None of this has anything to do with the original, The Hound of the Baskervilles story by Arthur Conan Doyle. But there is also aspects to this that does play into that. The cat that was having the visions of this giant hulking hound with the red eyes, this devil hound and everything, there are shades of that are taken off the page from the original story. And I love that you have something so predominantly Holmes. There are certain aspects in certain scenes where it's word for word, taken right off the page. And that one point in the story where he says that iconic phrase, once you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Of course, it's worded differently in this particular adaptation. I like that they play with the dialogue here and there, you know, all throughout. But again, the idea that this is doing with somebody's trying to mess with this kid who witnessed his father die. And, you know, in the original story, I think it was something along the lines of people wanted to take down, like, the heir to family wealth. And they had done so by exploiting the idea of madness. And in this particular case, it's this guy who's grown up with this fearful borderline madness about having witnessed his father mutilated by a hellhound, and it's all a psychotic induced, you know, false memory and all this kind of stuff exploited to make him seem like a babbling idiot, so nobody would take his story seriously. And Holmes is immediately drawn into it. And I also like the idea that, you know, the word hound was an abbreviation. It was talking about the group who were doing these studies and plays on that kind of stuff. Lestrade is another character I didn't expect to see as often as we do, and it was absolutely hilarious to see him on vacation looking, I think it was brown as a nut, Sherlock calls him. And if I remember correctly, I think that is a line from one of the original Canon stories as well. You know, when you get beyond that, when you finally round everything out with this final story, the Reichenbach Fall, this is a direct allusion to the story, The Final Problem, and this is a line of dialogue that crops up in that episode time and time again, especially spouted by Moriarty, as portrayed by Andrew Scott, who I have to give accolades for. His first appearance in Series 1, I was not all that impressed with him until we got to that very end, that climactic sort of cliffhanger where he is confronting and has taken hostage, you know, John Watson, and he's confronting Holmes, and I just could not wrap my head around, with everything, how that all culminated, how they were going to get out of that scenario. And the first scene in the first episode, Scandal in Belgravia, picks up directly with this, and I love how the scene is interrupted by the Bee Gees' Staying Alive. I love that song. I love the sort of, I don't know, I don't want to say irony. I feel like that's the poor choice of words, but it's so strange and yet so befitting of the way the character of Moriarty is. And how that pertains, you know, that song pertains, calling back to Irene Adler and his association with her. And she wants to play the game ultimately with Holmes because of her attraction and her being very much, you know, she feels for Holmes like he is scintillating, much as he would, you know, feel for her. And I would be left feeling for the portrayal of the character by Laura Pulver. But in this final story, we finally have the game is afoot. You know, as far as Moriarty is making his move, he has been able to exploit, which explains a scene, I forget which episode it's in, but precursor to this, where he's being let out of a cell and he's written the name Sherlock all over the walls. He has an obsession for Sherlock, and he wants to bring that to a head, bring that to its natural conclusion. And the idea, because of how similarly pitched they are, Sherlock Holmes being a consulting detective, as it were, and Moriarty being a consulting sort of criminal, you know, all of that stuff is pitched to go against. They're going to turn the tides on Sherlock and make him be disbelieved, make him seem like a falsity. And it really speaks to that story, The Final Problem. The biggest problem with the original story was you didn't get to see the events. You saw everything building up to this dynamic coming to a head between Holmes and Moriarty, but no one was there to see it. Watson, in the original story, he had to go back to an inn and look after the care of somebody that was ill or whatever it was, and he realizes that this was probably a ruse, and he tries to double back. And by the time he gets back to Reichenbach Falls, which is where this all culminates in the original canon, the death, air quotes, of Sherlock Holmes in a fight, very much in that story, can Watson only speculate what has happened to his nearest and dearest friend. And he kind of just wraps up the story, the conclusion being that, well, I guess they must have both died. Shrug, you know. And later it would be because of just fan outcry. people had grown to so love and be moved and had their minds challenged by the concept of a man like Sherlock Holmes, that when Conan Doyle killed off his character, he was tired of having to be chained to this character and that be the one trick pony that anyone ever associated with his name. He wanted an end to it. Even his own mother, he would write his mother and consult her, and she would tell him, you bring that character back, you're not killing him off. She was so endeared to the character. So we had a story that would then pick up with, well, Holmes faked his death and all that kind of stuff. But again, without that sort of prologue to the concluding story or picking up story that would tell us, oh, Sherlock Holmes actually faked his death, he was actually really still alive, and this, that, and the other thing, people were after him. This episode, you know, the Reichenbach Fall, it gives us a Holmes who is the Reichenbach hero. It calls directly to that. And there's even a point through one of the episodes where Watson's blog, you know, the view count is stuck at 1895. And I assumed this to probably be a reference to the date, the year that that story was published. I think it was in the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes or one of those. I don't remember exactly what the original printing was called. But I also became aware of a poem that was written by a Vincent Starrett called 221B. And the final line of that particular poem is, it's always 1895, talking about the feel, the vibe, that Victorian London essence of Sherlock Holmes, the best remembered of the original canon, the look and the feel and the style of all of that. And so I began to think, you know, not only is this 1895 sort of a precursor to the idea that we're building up to Holmes allegedly dying, killing himself, or dying in a fight with Moriarty, but it's also probably a reference to this poem, which commemorates the all-time essence of these characters. And that, again, for me, calls back to Cumberbatch's and Martin Freeman's portrayals, because as I'm watching these stories, it's an absolutely modern world. It's an absolutely modern, you know, the appliances, the mobile devices, the computers, the laptops, you know, all of these things are modern things that exist now. And yet the concepts and the characterizations, the portrayals of these characters feel like they are off the page of that 1895 equivalent. The characters feel like the real people, like the real characters, if they were real people, put it that way. And so you have this story where Holmes is being disgraced at every turn, and you have Moriarty, who has so concocted this idea to disgrace Holmes by making Moriarty out to be a figment of his imagination, something he invented. And then it goes one step further and says, no, he actually invented it. He hired this guy, Richard Brooke, to portray the character. And again, calling back to the Nicholas Meyer book and film based on that novel, The 7% Solution, there's a whole idea about, you know, Holmes as being, or having been in, a cocaine-induced sort of hysteria. And he made Moriarty, in his mind, this criminal among criminals, the worst of them all in the entire world. And there's actually a very intriguing twist, a reveal in that original story, 7% Solution, by Nicholas Meyer, in that investigation of that concept. It gives you an entirely different framework to play with, and that's exactly what this particular episode does. Again, taking the basis in the way these characters are represented and building off that, and then weaving its own story while retaining all of that charm and all of that characterization and all of that compelling nature of the mystery, of how Holmes gets involved with it, of how he deduces the crime, and building to a literal crescendo. And I have to give you a warning, if you've watched the video up to this point and you haven't seen Series 2, it was a long time coming for me, finally caught up with it, but if you haven't seen how that episode ends, Reichenbach Fall, you don't want to watch the video from here. I will be spoiling a key component to the final aspect, the final scenes of the final problem, if you will, of that story. So I assume if you haven't clicked off the video, you will be sticking with me. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, let's jam. So we have this rooftop meeting. And finally, Holmes has actually gone back to the one person he can trust, but also knows nobody else will be gunning for, because as Moriarty warns him, you've got Watson under, the scope of a rifle for assassination. You've got Mrs. Hudson in the presence of somebody who will kill her. And you've got Lestrade being, sort of about to be gunned down. And the idea Moriarty has concocted is, if you do not leap off the roof of this hospital, nothing I say will stop this. Your death is the only thing that will prevent their deaths. And so it is absolutely, with these two minds being faced, off against each other, in a life and death, a true blood life and death scenario where there is no speculation, there is no, Watson is left to wonder what happened. He's there to witness at least the end of it. But Holmes is called upon this girl, Molly, who he's constantly not even realizing, because of his lack of conceiving social conventions and that he does hurt feelings, and he doesn't care about that. His mind is like a cold machine, a logic machine, so to call on her, I was like so gratefully satisfied that her character now became integral to the story. By calling on her, nobody else would ever know that there was any rapport, any dynamic, nobody would ever be gunning for her, as I say. And I have to assume, without knowing beyond how this episode ended and not seeing Series 3 thus far, as of the time of this recording, I can only assume that her working with cadavers and bodies must have had something to do with Holmes's seeming suicide jumping off the rooftop. Now, what completely blew my mind, and forgive the pun, is that Moriarty, to get that decisive blow so that there's no going back, the only true-blooded way he could win, and the whole time he believes Holmes has let him down. He believes Holmes is just ordinary, that they are not pitch-perfectly matched mentally. But the only way he can get in that decisive blow, he says it himself, as long as I'm alive, and, Holmes kind of taunts him along these lines, as long as I'm alive, there's still a whisper, there's still a chance that you could prevent the deaths of your friends and walk off this roof. But he doesn't want that. Even if he can't witness it, he doesn't want Holmes to win. He pulls out a gun and blows his brains out. And my jaw dropped, because, Andrew Scott is, as an actor playing this role, had evolved from being almost laughable in those first scenes we ever see him in, when you don't even know he's Moriarty, to becoming a legitimately psychotic threat, very ominous in those final scenes of Season 1, Series 1, and the evolution just became more twisted and darker, so that his portrayal of Moriarty is almost, to my mind, to my estimation, the best of the most criminally psychotic you will ever see, a villain of renown. I am so blown away by Andrew Scott's portrayal of this character. And that final choice, the mastery, I have to just applaud, the mastery of Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, not only Gatiss's portrayals of Mycroft, and the idea that his, again, talking about spoilers for this final episode, the Reichenbach Fall, his being integral in his own brother's undoing, and not even realizing that was the eventual outcome. Because the idea, the pursuit of greed and the knowledge, and being able to seek this so-called code that Moriarty was exploiting, there was never a code. It was all a ruse. It was all a bait and switch. It was all to take Holmes down. Just, my God, and I was speechless by the end. Of course, I knew Holmes wouldn't be dead. I knew he would have faked his death. But that scene of him jumping off the rooftop just blew my mind. I was like, there's no way. There's no way they can back out of that. How are they ever going to explain that? Much as I was left, compelled and wondering how the cliffhanger was going to pick up from the end of Series 1. When you see Watson, we begin sort of the whole idea of his going to his therapist and trying to deal with the emotions he's feeling and the contempt for what Holmes did, and the idea that he can't even conceive of there being any truth to what Holmes tells him in the moments before he seemingly jumps, that it was all a lie, that it was all his own concoction, that Moriarty was right, and all this stuff. Watson just expresses this notion that he was alone in the world. He found a brother. He found someone platonically to be in love with, a family member, somebody closer than anyone he could ever meet in the world. As much as they are adversarial, they complete each other. And that's a notion that goes back to the original canon and goes back to many explorations thereupon. And it's just utmost compelling. You know, I've talked a lot in videos I've done talking about anime series and such. A lot of the series I cover really explore that a lot of the time. The idea of people who aren't related coming together and being closer knit and having a bond stronger than blood sometimes. And that's something that's a great soliloquy for how things sometimes happen in the real world. Sometimes people alternate in and out of your life, but sometimes they are closer than blood, if you can find the right person. And for Watson, that was Holmes. And for Holmes, though he would be begrudging to admit it, that was Watson. And maybe Irene Adler to a point as well, if he could have his way. But just absolutely mind-blowingly frickin' awesome. Absolutely. I don't know. I mean, I could sit here and just spout off superlative after superlative, and it would never be enough with how I'm left, especially by the end of Series 2. And I'm told Series 3 gets even better by some people. Some people said it wasn't as good, but whatever. That will remain to be seen for when I can get my hands on it and experience it for myself. And just a couple other footnotes, things like The Speckled Blonde. One of my all-time favorite stories is The Speckled Band. Playing on the titles of certain things, you know, I love those little references, those little nods that are put in there coyly sometimes. There's a point in one of the episodes where Holmes walks in with like a spear or something like that, and he looks all disheveled, maybe covered in mud or blood or whatever it is, and I can't think of the story it hails from, but there is one where he does have like a harpoon or whatever it is. It's just like, again, with Series 1, you know, he's taking shots using a gun against the wall and doing all this stuff. They thoroughly have found a way to modernly adapt and weave new stories while retaining the characterizations and the feel of those personalities, and even, I would say, expounding upon them. You know, one of my all-time favorite Holmes adaptations is the Grenada series with Jeremy Brett. And that is almost right off the page, literally adapting the stories. And you have something quite different. It's a quite different animal, a different beast, this modern Sherlock take, because it still manages, as I say, and I will keep banging on and on and on about this fact, it still retains the characterizations, the performances of Benedict Cumberbatch, of Martin Freeman, of the supporting cast, Mrs. Hudson, Lestrade, Moriarty, Irene Adler. There is something about them all where it is vastly different from what is on the original page, and yet at the same time, you're watching Sherlock Holmes. You're watching that character. You're watching his adventures or misadventures, unsolved adventures, whatever it is, which, by the way, he's not too pleased when, you know, Watson ends up putting that on his blog, those ones that were missed opportunities and he didn't solve, whatever. But that's the charm. That's just why I love this so much. And I'm just so sorry that it took me so many years to finally pick up with it, because I've been told by several of my friends online through Facebook and everything like that, and Howard making this available to me. Thank you again, sir. Even, you know, from all of you, basically, I've been told time and time again, if you have any love or fascination, even vaguely, with Sherlock Holmes, you have to watch this. And I'm glad, so glad I was finally able to. And so that is my long, rambling summarization of Sherlock Series 2, or Season 2 as it's known over here in the States. And I can't wait to see where they went from here, how they pick up with it, how Holmes reveals himself to Watson. And I have to imagine that this Watson is going to feel levels of relief and satisfaction to know his friend, somebody who is like blood now, you know, like his brother, is alive. But if he doesn't all out deck Holmes, I'm going to be largely shocked. You know, when he crops up again. And knowing the original story, how Holmes sort of creeps into the window late at night one night, and Watson's just like, what? You know, like, I really can't wait to see how his debut as Series 3 begins plays out. And so, yeah, otherwise I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you thought of Sherlock, whether it's, you know, Season 1, Season 2. Don't let me know too much about Series 3 because, again, I haven't seen it as yet and I don't want to be spoiled going into it. But what overall are your thoughts on, you know, the portrayals of Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, as I say, of Holmes and Watson respectively, the other surrounding cast, the way these stories played out, you know, did it wow you? Did you love it? Or does it leave much to be desired? Anything goes in the comments below. We can, you know, agree to disagree. I just love having the conversation. So, yeah, otherwise that'll be pretty much it for me on this, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.